Here now a reading from the Gospel according to John, where we'll be reading from chapter 11, verses 32 through 44. And as I read these words, would you listen for a good word from the Lord? When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to him, "Unbind him and let him go." This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. A little over 4 years ago, I sat with the pastor search team here at Augusta Road Baptist Church. They asked me a question. Have you ever led a funeral before? It's probably an appropriate question, I would imagine, particularly if you're looking at a young minister, trying to size him or her up to determine if not only this person could bring a good word to us from the pulpit every Sunday, but would he or she know what to do that would carry us through all seasons of life, perhaps most especially the very end. Would he or she know what to say when no one else seems to know? Have you ever done a funeral? They asked. I paused for a moment and I said, well, no, I've never put one together. I've never led one myself. I mean, I've been to plenty of funerals before. I know the basic elements. I know how they go. I know the purpose behind them and what we're trying to communicate about the hope of God, even in the midst and in the presence of death. There was an assignment in seminary that we were given where we had to pretend that the funeral home had called us, and they had someone who had not been in a church before, and they asked us to do the funeral, and they gave us a few stories that helped us to understand a little bit about that person, and we had a couple of days to put together the scriptures that needed to be read, maybe some songs that would be sung, and to even write out a eulogy. Does that count? I mean, I remember being a youth minister, and I was asked to say a prayer at the funeral for the grandfather of a couple in my youth group. And I actually think that I really started to first understand the call that God had placed upon my life when one of my fraternity brothers, who had actually joined the Marines after 9/11, was killed in Iraq. And they were going to have a memorial service that would be open to the entire university. And the fraternity president came to me, I guess probably knowing my father was a pastor, and said, "Matt, somebody's got to give a prayer. Would you do it?" I think I first felt God whispering something to me as I was the one who was called to speak words of hope and truth even into that situation. But no, I've never done a funeral before, at least not by myself. They sat there for a moment and said, "Well, if you come here, you're going to get plenty of experience, and you're going to get it quickly." Just the other day, actually, I looked into my computer hard drive, and I looked at that folder that every pastor has, and it's just labeled funerals. And I looked at all of the different orders of worship and just the sermons that I had written For those that I've been asked to perform a funeral for here, members of this church, some who were kind of family extended, some people who have passed on have not actually asked for a funeral. They didn't want one, so there wasn't much that needed to be done. But I actually totaled them up. And over the last 4.5 years, I've been asked to be a part of, to construct, or to lead in some way 44 funerals. We're averaging 11 funerals a year right now. And that's just the way it goes sometimes. Because at this point, outside of this example and the example of Jesus himself, death has at this point a 100% success rate. Death actually comes for us all. And even here in this moment, we recognize, perhaps on this day most especially, that even in the midst of that reality, there is a future promise that remains. A promise that says that what we face now and the certainty and the reality of the death that is coming for us all will not, in fact, have the last word. And so even though we come and we read names and we recognize that we have spent way too much time around the graveside, way too much time mourning and shedding tears, and even lifting each other up in the ways that we are called to do, we hold on to the fact that this is simply a temporary separation. That because of the hope of Jesus Christ, there will come a time when we will be reunited with those we love and all of those who have been faithful followers of Jesus Christ. In the face of death, we hold on to the words of the psalmist that weeping may tarry for the night, but joy still comes in the morning. We recognize the truth of the words of the Apostle Paul, who said, I don't want you to grieve as others who have no hope. But for us, because of the work of Jesus Christ, there is always a hope to which we can cling. St. Augustine said that there's a funny thing about hope, that it actually has two daughters, anger and courage. Hope in the Christian sense is angered by the reality that we face today, a recognition that this world is not yet as it should be. But it also comes with the courage to do something about it. And I believe that that is, at least in some ways, the hope that we see portrayed by even Jesus himself in this passage from the Gospel of John. This great miracle, this great sign, according to John, that points to exactly who Jesus is. Lazarus had died, and Jesus finally made his way there after some delay and much prayer. Mary meets him and confronts him because she's angered by the reality that her brother is now gone. And she calls Jesus to account on it, she thinks. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And perhaps there's some truth to that. After all, we've already seen through the Gospels the miraculous things that Jesus can do. He's healed blind people. He has actually lifted other people up off of their deathbed, in fact. And yet there Lazarus lies in the grave. And Jesus begins to weep. We're not really told exactly why Jesus was weeping. Maybe he was just sad because his friend had passed away. Maybe he was concerned over the lack of faith or understanding that those who had been gathered there seemed to not just get what Jesus was trying to do. But I think there's some sense of hope that St. Augustine speaks to that we find in the very tears of Jesus himself. That the God who created the world and recognized the peril of the separation that comes with us because of sin, who decided to do something about it and actually come in the person of Jesus Christ, met us at the graveside and met us in our sorrow, met us in our grief and in our pain, that there would be no experience that we would face in this world that God himself has not also faced. It's a simple verse. Outside of John 3:16, it's the one that many of us memorize first because it's probably the shortest. But there is profound truth in the fact that Jesus wept with those who were weeping. He was angered, I think, in some ways by the reality of the world in which he was walking. Not just the systems that were there that were keeping people in oppression, but even more than that, the reality of death itself, maybe even the death that he would have to face. But he's not deterred by it. He still recognizes that something needs to be done, and so he stands there in a loud voice and proclaims, "Lazarus, come out!" Because death will not have the final word. Death will not have the final say. And those who recognize how to live with hope in the present reality that is clung to the future promise are the ones that we can celebrate on this day who are truly saints of the church. They recognize what theologian Brian Peterson said when he said, Jesus is life itself. Jesus himself is resurrection, defeat of death. Jesus is the place where death ends and everlasting life begins. And without denying the final promise of resurrection and death's final elimination, the life of Jesus breaks into our present and transforms it. What we need to hear is that on both sides of the grave, there is life for us because Jesus has been sent to call our names and call us out of our graves. On both sides of the grave, Jesus is life for us. Those whom we celebrate as the saints of the church taught us that. I've heard it said that those who pass on, as we grieve them, it never gets easier. It just gets hard less often. I think that sense is found in John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany when he said that you don't lose someone all at once, but you lose them in little bits and pieces. That first the mail stops coming in her name, and then her scent falls off the pillow. And ultimately you have an accumulation of all of the things that they left behind. And I think for us, most of all, it is the example of those who understood that there is always hope to be found here in this world, even when life is its darkest, even when everyone else believes that there is no hope to be found. They taught us lessons that we can live in this world with faith and love for God and for others, and in that way, we don't deny the reality of the death that is coming for us, but we stand in defiance of it, saying that death and all of its forces will not have control over us because we have faith in the one who has already won the victory. There's a 1968 movie called The Lion in Winter. It tells the story of Henry II and the fact that he won't pass on, it seems, the throne to his sons. His sons and his wife sort of want to force him into a position in which he will finally make a choice. And I think towards the end of the movie, John and Richard and Jeffrey are locked in the dungeon. In ways they've turned against their father, and he's coming forth to pass judgment. And it's almost as if they hear him echoing down those cavernous halls. And Richard says, "Here he comes. But he'll get no satisfaction from me. He won't find me begging." And Jeffrey looks over at him and says, "You fool, as if the way a man falls matters." And Richard responds, "When the fall is all there is, it matters. It matters a great deal." And in fact, if we recognize that death itself is coming for us, the way that we live here and now matters a great deal. Because Jesus is still there, calling us out of our tombs, forcing us to confront the reality of God's world, not just the certainty of the death that comes in this one. Death comes for us all. And yet we have the potential to live with hope here and now because of Jesus Christ. In a way that says that we not only need to not be terrified of death, but we don't need to be terrified of this life either. That all of the challenges that face us can be overcome, or they can be met head on with the certainty that there is one who has already beaten the grave itself. So all the divisions that are among us, all of those who would seek to do us harm, can simply sit there, because Christ is still calling us to life. The examples of the saints that have gone on before us teach me, and I hope they teach you, that there is no grief or pain or terror or turmoil that this life can bring us, where Jesus can't reach down into those depths and pull us up and call our names, call us out of our graves, and call us to new life. May we be the signs of the hope for the world that it so desperately needs.